Hello, my name's John Hawley. I'm from RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. And I'm going to be talking to you today about nutrition for the marathon. If one word sums up the marathoner's concern, as far as nutritional concerns, it's fuel. If we look at the first slide, we can see in this schematic that there are large numbers of fuel depots in the body. Glycogen stored in the muscle, that's the storage form of carbohydrate. Intramuscular triglycerides stored both within the muscle and also subcutaneously as fat, and also a store of glucose in the liver and also in the bloodstream. The concern for the marathon runner who uses predominantly carbohydrate during marathon events and also training for marathon events is that the carbohydrate stores in the body represent a very finite supply. And whereas we have an abundance of fat and fat stores, carbohydrate stores are very well protected and, as we mentioned, are very finite. So nutritional concerns both before the marathon, during training for the marathon, and certainly during recovery sessions and training from the marathon are emphasizing carbohydrate replenishment in the muscle. This slide, although a schematic cartoon, has actually been backed up by scientific evidence in several recent studies, and it shows the effects of athletes undertaking hypothetical training sessions with two very different carbohydrate intake regimens. The first athlete in this example is an athlete who trains on a very low carbohydrate diet, perhaps 40% of their total daily intake from carbohydrate. As you can see on the first day of training, at the top left-hand side of the graph, they start with normal muscle glycogen stores of around 100 millimoles per kilogram wet weight. They do a 2-hour training session on day 1, and of course muscle glycogen stores are depleted. Now the problem here is that this athlete doesn't follow good nutritional guidelines and then maintains a diet relatively low in carbohydrate, and as a result you can see that the bounce and effect of the graph, it doesn't come back to the starting point. In actual fact, it's much lower. And so the runner starts the second day at 24 hours there with glycogen levels of around 75 millimoles. You can see the rest of the progression. What happens? The athlete continues with their training, and by the end of the third day, when they're doing very severe training sessions of perhaps 90 minutes to a couple of hours a day, the muscle glycogen levels have dropped to very low levels, and indeed at this stage the athlete would have trouble maintaining their training intensity or training pace. So here's a situation where the athlete would be limited by fuel availability. Compare and contrast this now to the athlete in the yellow who's ingesting a high carbohydrate diet between training sessions, however undertaking the same training sessions. I think it's clear to see that the bounce back effect is much better. This athlete is able to at least put back some of the carbohydrate that was lost during training sessions, and although the trend is still on the downward side, this athlete has far more fuel available for the training sessions and subsequently recovers from the training sessions better and is better able to cope with the demands of training. What does this mean as far as nutrition is concerned then? Here's a graph from a very old study, and again the data have been replicated many times recently, showing the relationship between the amount of carbohydrate that an athlete takes in on the bottom axis there, that's in grams per day, along the upper axis, the y-axis, showing the rate at which the muscle is able to take up and store that muscle glycogen. You can see, as indicated by the dotted line here just going across the graph, that there appears to be a threshold. That is, the graph at the top of the axis actually plateaus off. This coincides with about an intake of 600 to 700 grams of carbohydrate per day. And I think there are two practical take-home messages from this slide. Firstly, if you're ingesting a diet which is low in carbohydrate, that is coming to the left of that line, we know that muscle glycogen stores will not be replenished. On the contrary, we know that taking in a diet of around 600 to 700 grams will probably fully replenish muscle glycogen. We also know that in taking more than this amount probably leads to gastrointestinal disturbances and as the graph has plateaued off, probably doesn't increase muscle glycogen synthesis to any greater degree. So the take-home message from this slide is that low glycogen concentrations are the result of a low amount of carbohydrate consumed. The optimal concentration coincides with the two lines on the graph of around 700 grams a day, and any amount over this probably isn't necessary. Here's a schematic to just summarize the effects in practical terms of what happens to an athlete who is taking in inadequate dietary carbohydrate. If you have got an insufficient dietary carbohydrate, and we've just put some numbers on that in the previous slide, we know that you will begin some of your training sessions with low muscle glycogen concentrations. The effect of this is that you'll either have a slower recovery after training sessions, or indeed a diminished ability to undertake those training sessions. And here we have something called an increased RPE, that is an increased rating of perception of effort. An athlete will feel that every training run is actually harder than it should be. And this can be reflected by simply asking the athlete how they felt after a training session, or indeed looking at other more physiological markers. But the easiest way for the coach is basically just to ask the athlete how they feel. There's not a whole lot of evidence for this, but certainly the athlete and coach talk about a state of overreaching or staleness or overtraining. So although these terms in the medical literature are pretty hard to define and in actual fact incredibly hard to measure and detect, we know that the athlete complains of a feeling of fatigue and just not recovering. I might add that there are no markers that a physician could measure in the blood at the moment which would actually predict this. So in actual fact, by the time you get to the overtrained state, it's almost too late. So the thing here is prevention rather than cure. The bottom line of all this, and the point of the slide there, is that you come down with a bang. In red there, impaired training capacity and performance is the end result of all this cascade of events which basically start with an inadequate intake of dietary carbohydrate. That's training then. What about during the race? Well, there's been a lot of research undertaken looking at the effects of taking in various carbohydrate electrolyte drinks, comparing them to water and other beverages during exercise. And here's a study done a few years ago, but nonetheless still very reliable data, showing the effects of taking in either water, which of course has fluid but no energy, versus a carbohydrate electrolyte drink, which of course contains energy. And on your left, you can see the effects of muscle glycogen and the concentration there declining in type 1 muscle fibers. The body's composed of two types of muscle fibers, type 1 fibers and type 2 fibers. And the placebo here is the water trial given in the open bars, and the carbohydrate is the dark trial. And we really only need to concentrate on 2 points in this. Under the type 1 fibers, that you can see the exhaustion time with or without carbohydrate is massively different. The runners are only able to run for about 104 minutes when they ingest water, whereas when they ingest carbohydrate, they're able to exercise for almost half an hour longer. The effect is quite profound also in the type 2 fibers. If we look at rest there, you can see the muscle glycogen levels start the same. By 104 minutes, there's a little bit of glycogen left in both fiber types, but by the time you go out to 132 minutes, there is only glycogen left in the type 2 fiber, which has been subjected to carbohydrate intake. And therefore, we know that carbohydrate intake during actual marathon competition is very, very beneficial for the runner. And there really is no reason whatsoever for these days for just the ingestion of plain water. Let's try and summarize this and look at some of the practical recommendations, first of all for training and then for competition. As far as the athlete in training for the marathon, we know that you need a high energy intake to match the training demands, and coupled to the high energy intake, we emphasize a high carbohydrate intake. This may mean for most athletes up to 7 grams of carbohydrate for each kilogram of body weight of the athlete. We use a term periodization, namely that the athlete reduces their training before major competitions and increases their carbohydrate intake. We've also discussed the effects of inadequate fuel intake between training sessions, and we know that this impairs training performance. So the emphasis here is on adequate refueling between important training sessions. Fuel and fluid intake are obviously very, very important as well. Haven't discussed it in great detail, but there's no evidence for training with low muscle glycogen. There have been several studies published recently which perhaps sold the athlete a little bit towards a low training paradigm with low carbohydrate. We see no evidence for this in the scientific literature in trained runners. Certainly in females, there is a risk of low iron status, and particularly among vegetarians if they're emphasizing a low energy intake diet. As far as practical recommendations for competition, we know that you must carbohydrate load before a race, that is, increase the amount of carbohydrate taken in by the diet. And probably one very practical point which athletes tend to forget is that you must reduce the volume of training in order to allow the muscle to take in that extra carbohydrate and store it in the muscle and also into the liver as glycogen. We know that if you can and you're able to do, and your event doesn't start very early in the morning, it's advisable to top up your fluid and fuel levels before a race. And we also know that depending on the three factors here, the practical considerations, namely how many aid stations, the environmental considerations, whether it's hot or cold, and the physiological considerations, namely that some runners are able to tolerate large volumes of fluid during exercise, that these three factors will ultimately govern the fluid and fuel replacement regimens used by athletes during marathon competition.